We are now recording. So, all right. This is
Yeah,
Matt.
so let's.
Okay. No, you do the intro.
No, go, please.
No, I think you have a better voice.
I'll try.
Now you're on screen.
Okay, there we go.
So, this is Matt and Nick. We're Vogue Academy, and we thought it'd be cool to do some kind of recorded sessions where we don't really have an agenda. We're just talking. We met Saturday morning at our usual coffee spot, and we started talking about self-awareness. That's obviously fundamental to a lot of our courses and the courses coming down the pike. But the question is, how do you become self-aware? And so we started discussing that, because it's one thing to be self-aware, or in other words, what does it mean to be self-aware? That's a question that's been posed to me. So I don't know, Nick, would you have any initial thoughts on that?
Well, I think, yeah, this how, and we come from different traditions. So I think when we were chatting about this at the cafe, I think I asked you, thinking about the Christian mystic tradition, which has a lot of emphasis on, excuse me, gaining awareness of oneself. There's that question. Then I'm coming from a psychological, contemporary Western psychological, but also Buddhist perspective. And in early Buddhism, for sure, was a lot of emphasis on gaining awareness. And there's kind of two big methods of self-awareness, awareness of oneself by oneself. So there's two meanings of self there, or two dimensions. And so one of those called samadhi, and another called vipassana. A lot of those come with calming the body down, directing attention to one's senses, so breath, as an anchor. And the argument for many goes is, once you've done that, then a lot of other things arise into our consciousness, many of those things about ourselves. So that's one angle. And then we can notice and learn things about, on the one hand, our particular individual contents of our minds and experience, but we can also learn things about how human beings work, the mechanisms, the processes. That's a kind of self-awareness too. I might call it kind of the shared commonality of human beings, how our motivations, thoughts, feelings, things like that.
Cool.
Does that spark anything for you?
Yeah, well, it was interesting this morning. Well, after our discussion Saturday morning, I went off and started doing some initial research, and there are all these practices on how to become self-aware. And then what was interesting this morning, as I was reading Kierkegaard, that he came from a position that most of us don't want to become self-aware, which was interesting, because he felt that once you become self-aware, you're going to start wrestling with some really deep issues, not just previous traumas and whatnot that we've experienced, but also what would he call the void or nothingness. That this is a struggle that we have deep down inside of us, this nagging feeling that we are really nothing, and that our whole lives, as we talked about in terms of self-worth and trying to gain self-worth, is a way to kind of establish that we are something, even though there's this possibility that we're nothing. And the passage I was reading this morning, he was really wrestling with that in terms of death, that we grapple with the idea of death in terms of our actual extinction, like that we don't go on, but that is lurking down below. And so we don't want to become self-aware because we don't want to deal with that, I think. And there's also, I think, the fact that like I look at the Matrix movies that deal with this, then they have those allegory of the cave in the background there, and that it's much easier just to kind of go with the flow and just be externally focused, like most people are, because then there's a crowd, there's companionship, where once you become self-aware, you're kind of by yourself, and that's hard. to sustain. And so a lot of people don't like that. So like that one character, he wanted to be re-entered into the matrix. He wanted to forget everything because he hated the kind of austere, um, difficult life that he had once becoming aware of what really was of true reality. So anyway, those are my thoughts initially.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of thinking of the traditions I know, and things I read about. Kind of combining, like I said, a contemporary psychology with Buddhist contemplation or meditation. I've never heard it. I don't know if I've heard it said or written that we're avoiding that awareness um, for because of the painfulness. I've definitely read that pain arises in seeking awareness. Maybe both those two things, but in any case, but definitely the latter, and then that becomes aversive, and so then one's avoiding it. Yeah, and I think in psychology, contemporary psychology, sort of post 1950s and 60s, and many therapeutic environments, we have this kind of real self, ideal self, a lot circles around the self, and it takes self as a very solid thing, as a thing that we want to cultivate and develop. And we can contrast it. In Buddhism, one of the objectives for one kind of Buddhism is to be nobody, not to be somebody or something, but actually to strive to be nobody, which is to embrace the kind of, sometimes you do hear the word void, that word's used in Zen Buddhism, or emptiness is a common term, that the self is a concept. The self concept is like any other concept. It's constructed. It would be a contemporary word. It's empty. And so, but one positive spin on that is that then it's another word for emptiness is openness. It's not predetermined. The continuity from moment to moment is much weaker than we imagine. That the self is not nearly as solid as we have come to believe for a variety of reasons. And while scary, frightening, it's also a possibility, an opportunity to remake ourselves in each moment and in each instant.
Well, that actually aligns with like a lot of the existential philosophers like Sartre and Heidegger and whatnot, like that there's the need to embrace or face up to the emptiness or void, and only then can you really truly make yourself, because you're not relying on social constructs or anything else that are less than the true self. The self has to choose itself in the midst of this emptiness. Whereas, Kierkegaard, who I, obviously follow and really, learn so much from, would say that is kind of true, but it doesn't embrace the reality that that's really frightening. That they're trying to avoid that at all costs, because it is so frightening. And yet, he would say that you do have to enter into that state. Like he would, but obviously he was Christian, and so he was thinking that you have to come to admit that as he would say, you are nothing and less than nothing, but that's in the presence of God that you come to that realization, and it's only then that you really are what you are. That we are we are God. God is the creator and the sustainer, and it's only by him or by God that we are being sustained. So that's Kierkegaard's approach. But for us, in terms of Voc Academy, I think you had a really good point that without becoming self-aware, you are prey to these maladaptions that you've developed that become habitual, and that lead to procrastination or flight, fight, or freeze responses, and other ways that we protect ourselves. And yet I think deep down, lurking below us is a restlessness to say this isn't right, this isn't wrong, and can we become self-aware and start digging down there so that we can somehow free ourselves from those types of responses. Right.
Yeah, I think my synthesis from the wisdom traditions and contemporary psychology and Buddhism. There's a lot of conversation back and forth. Starts with there's the organism is organized. We as human beings come to this particular moment, and that with we're not a totally blank slate. We have needs and drives. We are designed to be responsive to our social and cultural environment, right? That the fact that it's so hard to go against the stream is one thing, but we need, from my point of view, well, why is that? Well, that's how human beings are organized, right? We don't have claws and big teeth. What we have is the ability to relate to other people and feel connected, and that's a crucial not only human need, but it helps us survive in this, and has helped us survive in this environment. So we're really responsive to that culture. So we have these human needs that are manifest, and we seek to meet them in the context we're in, right? So in a highly achievement-oriented society that puts a lot of emphasis on, especially in the American context, on potential or talent, then we want those things. We're going to seek to fit in and belong and make connections to people by meeting those needs. And so you see people trying to achieve a lot. You see people trying to protect their sense of their capability a lot in that context, if they've internalized, been enculturated into that belief system. But underneath that is a more fundamental need, which is to belong, to be connected, to have affinity, to have relationship with in a group. And if we can imagine, if we were in another context, that people would strive to do that in other and different ways. So that kind of, from my point of view, a crucial kind of point is self-awareness starts by an understanding, and more than that, an acceptance that we're going to have these impulses and urge and drives and needs. That's what they are. And they don't always get manifest positively, but in pro-socially, but they can. They don't always manifest in line with our own principles, but we can learn to do that. So these are powerful forces that can be and needs that we can direct. But first we have to, you said, gain awareness. So how do we gain awareness? Well, we actually, I think we have to have some acceptance. The point of view is that if we don't accept it, then we'll reject it, we'll deny it, and then we can't gain awareness, right? We repress it, we push it away, at least sometimes. So what's the role of acceptance? What does that mean is a big question in awareness too. And I think it's hard to get our heads around. Accept meaning accept the reality, not accept the benefit or positive, or whether it's adaptive or maladaptive. Simply accept that it is. We did do that. We have these feelings. And then with that acceptance, we can get a little deeper into the awareness. Well, where does that come from? If we make judgments, often that closes down analysis, is my observation. So if we can accept at least that it is, then we can say,
Right.
Why does that being expressed in that way? Why am I acting in ways that I actually don't value? Why am I doing things that are against my own precepts or my own desires or my own wish to be actualized or realized? Why is that? And I think someone who studies procrastination, I think that's a special case. It's this behavior. Most people don't want to do it. Most people have tried to stop doing it and they can't. And that, to me, is a unique window on the complexity of human beings and human action. Yeah.
Yeah, I think your point about acceptance is really important, because I think the acceptance allows you to examine, right? I mean, like, versus just saying no or deny or whatever and reject. It's just to say, well, I'm having this, but then the second step is, the why, or is this right? Is this this is where I want to be, or where I want to kind of invest myself? Because, and here I'm going back to Kierkegaard, like he really wrestled with the idea of doubt and how important that was, and what makes doubt even possible for us. So, and I think for him, that was a key for creating self-awareness, as we've talked about, the two sets of writings he had, and how I think there's that sense when you have this, deep down inside of us, there's these fundamental needs, self-worth, but then the self-worth has, even that, I think there's conditions on self-worth. And Kierkegaard talked about these contrasts, like we want something that's trustworthy, unchanging, something we can really trust, that will always be there. And that's what's, but we tend to invest ourselves in people's acceptance, our work, money, all these things that we might have, but we can't ultimately control. And so we have it for this moment, but what about an hour from now, a week, and a year, and so we kind of know that deep down. And so that's what creates this anxiety, like low level anxiety that we always have. And do we get to a point where we say, I can't just, I don't want to be like this. This is unsatisfying ultimately. And I think that's what points to what we always talk about, the intrinsic motivations. Like, if something's intrinsic, it's always there because it's inside you. It can always offer itself versus extrinsic motivations. So, but then again, it's a harder life. And I'm kind of jumping ahead, but it's to be intrinsically motivated is to go against the grain inherently, because most people are extrinsically motivated. So, yeah.
Well, in the Buddhist tradition, it's called going against the stream. So you step into the stream, and the metaphor of the stream is used a lot. It's the person who seeks enlightenment is bodhisattva. It's called a stream entrant, and it's specifically against the stream, not with it.
Right.
The flow. And there's a allegory from Buddhist traditions. But so interesting that you are making a connection to some things I've read. That I didn't really understand in some of the history, reading some of the history of the philosophy of Buddhism and history of Buddhism, and the historical person, Siddhartha Gautama, that became called the Buddha, at the time in this discussion of Hindu Brahmin philosophy, there was this pursuit of what's eternal, what's unchanging, what's enduring, and the Buddha said it's not the soul, actually, though that was put back into Buddhism later. What's eternal is consciousness and awareness, specifically. So if you use the word awareness, that's particularly interesting because we're talking about self-awareness. So the thing that we have as human beings is awareness. So in some ways, Descartes almost said it. He said, I think, therefore I am. I think a Buddhist would say, I think, therefore there is consciousness. Right. I know that I'm thinking, therefore there's consciousness. Whether you are is another matter. That's actually an inference. But there is something that knows you're thinking, and that thing is called awareness. That's the starting point. So for Buddhists, that's the endurability. And the reason that came to me is, particularly in my understanding of Tibetan Buddhism, it puts a lot of attention on awareness of awareness. So other traditions put an emphasis like awareness of what you're seeing, of your senses, awareness of what you're thinking. So the mental object, you can be metacognitive in a contemporary word. What am I thinking? But the Tibetan Buddhists say, but what's the thing that's aware of that?
Right.
You can be aware of that. So there, have you ever heard the term "be here now"? That was a thing in the 60s. It's very much a kind of Eastern, but you might say be aware now. So be here now is about your physical body. Awareness starts with the body. Your body is an awareness, and that gives us insight into the nature of reality. Yuval Harari talked about this. You start by saying, what's just paying attention to your breath, my body, and then that opens up all kinds of other awarenesses. But in any case, this idea of that awareness is the enduring thing. It is the thing in the universe, and actually, some physicists are starting to talk about this quite a lot. Consciousness as the animating force of the universe. But it's interesting. I hadn't really understood very well until you talked about it. Why this pursuit of the eternal? Why this pursuit of the thing that's unchanging? Whether it's a soul or something else, in this case, awareness. But now I get it. That Kierkegaard said, if we don't have something that's stable, that anchors us, that we can hang on to, then we're going to have this unease. We're going to have just disquiet. We want solidity. We want stability as human organisms. And in fact, I think the Buddhist point of view, we invent it, we create it. And one of the things we create is a self. to have stability, to seek, because we want to we reify all these things. We make them mentally unstable because they are literally physically not stable, but we need that. That's the underlying, the really most basic need. I never really understood it in those terms before.
So what, just pulling it back, when we think for Vogue Academy, we talked, I mean, obviously, again, self-awareness is just absolutely fundamental to every course, everything we're trying to help people do in their own lives. In a way, it starts with self-awareness, because you have to do self-examination and kind of understand what's going on below the surface to understand these certain behaviors that we're trying to overcome, or reactions to certain situations. So is it, for us, is it kind of, do we just need to assume that people are self-aware? Or, do you know what I mean? Like, it's one thing to be like, kind of like, start asking, like, who am I? Why am I doing it? Asking these questions. It's another thing to practice self-awareness in terms of, we talked about, like, the time where you're really trying to understand your body, listen, feel your breath and focus your attention on the body and other things. Does that make sense? So there's practices to become more self-aware, and then there's that kind of initial, like, self-awareness that has to happen, I think. What do you think about that?
Well, if I understand correctly, I think I would say that virtually all human beings have the capacity for
Right.
self-awareness.
Yeah.
Whether they've developed the capability is another matter, and that can be developed quite a lot. Then there's the question of implementation, of actually doing it on a regular basis. So I make this distinction in Buddhist practices that, so you can get instruction about how to meditate, for instance, and then you meditate, which is training for how to be in the world. And to the extent that you bring that mindfulness and awareness to the world, that's called practice. It's practice because you continually do it, not practice like practicing for the shot put, practice as in an act, the craft of living every day. And so I think we can, in various ways, train ourselves to enhance our capacity. And from some certain Buddhist tradition, it's that capacity is always there. Actually, what we're doing is removing the obscurations. We're removing the mud from the lens. It's not that we have to make anything or create anything. Humans have awareness, and including self-awareness. What we need to do is remove the things that obscure our ability to be aware, to use the metaphor, to see it. And that's hard and not easy. But then then we need to use that lens on a regular basis, right? So that's the abstract. I think just one thing that struck me, one of the reasons I started really thinking about self-awareness is, there's a really great book on procrastination by Burka and Yuen, and they describe self-awareness as a strategy, and that kind of blew my mind. I didn't think of it as a strategy, and they said the research, they believed that the single most powerful strategy for overcoming procrastination was self-awareness. And someone who does a lot of work around strategy, I thought, that's not a strategy. What do you mean? And it really interrupted my thinking. But that it was so powerful. They said it's the single most important thing. And I had to really stop and examine that. And I don't, so then it kind of, from there, you extrapolate and say, well, why would it only be the most powerful strategy for only procrastination? There's a parallel. I study how people transition into college. The students who do the best in college are not always the best high school students, but they're the students who are the most metacognitive. Metacognition is the single biggest factor for success in college. Well, metacognition is a lot like self-awareness.
Right.
There's the awareness of my processes in general, and then in real time, what we would call monitoring and assessing. So maybe that's the third part, what I was just talking about. You have the capacity, the capacity, then the capability, then the implementation is, are you doing it in real time? Am I right now aware of what's going on? And that would be a dimension of metacognition too, this online, so to speak, awareness.
Right. No, I totally agree. For me, at least, there's still the interesting question that the capacity or the capability to developing the capacity. There's still a little gap there
Yeah.
for me. Like,
Say some more about that.
in the sense that, if I have the capacity, it's not. I'm aware, but most likely I'm aware of just things are going on, doing my work. We're having this conversation. I'm not necessarily aware of what's going on inside me.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of am because I am myself, but I'm not attending to it
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of, oh, I want Nick to like me. I want him to think I'm smart. Like those kind of
Yeah.
questions they're lurking and they're definitely down inside me, but I'm not necessarily attending to them. And I think it's very easy for most of us, as we started off this discussion, to be in that state of kind of treadmill, autopilot, where in a way we are always grappling with those issues deep down inside us, but we're not attending to them.
Yeah.
And the question is, it's not like some people have it and some people are that way, others aren't. What and some people weren't and then become so. Like
Mm-hmm.
what does it? Are there certain things that just make you become more self-aware and and I think we have these moments in life where we do become more self-aware, like, the kind of high school identity crisis, midlife crisis, those times where all the lived world structures that we create tend to crumble and we're kind of like trying to put everything back together, maybe a little bit better than we had previously. Um, but I'm still like, okay. And the reason I asked this is the thing I told you is I was leading a Bible study in my church, and we were talking about I was talking about the importance of self-awareness for Christian contemplatives. And afterwards, he's like, "I get this, I understand it's important, but how do you become self-aware?" And I was kind of stumped. I was like, that's a really good question." I mean, it's one thing to be. I'm like, become
Yeah.
self-aware, and people are like, "What does that mean?" I don't know. So, or how do you
Well, I
start?
think,
Or how do you get there?
well, yeah, that's a good question. I think from a certain traditions in Buddhism, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The one is the Theravada tradition. There's this whole stream of thinking and inquiry captured in what's called the Abhidharma. I mean, you used the word. You said people are not attending. So I think uh, attention, the technology of directing, of learning how to direct our attention, is arguably what Buddhism,
Mhm.
many of those practices are. There's another question, which is the Buddhist ethics, which is then for what purpose. But yeah, so attention, and that attention we can learn to direct our attention, and we've had many conversations, and in our world today, attention is a huge conversation. It's the attention economy. This is a word on a lot of people's lips. But so we can direct our attention and we can learn to get better at attention. And I think turning that attention inward, I think I don't know this a lot, but a lot about this, but I think might be a definition of contemplative, as contemplation is to introspect,
Mhm.
so the spect, to look internal, inside. We tend to, as human beings, retrospect, look back, and
True.
prospect and look
Right.
forward. A
Right.
little bit of circumspect, look around, but
Right.
relatively little introspect.
Right.
But it's not that we can't. So, but to me, the issue there is, where do we look? Where do we put our attention? And then we get more self-aware by getting better at managing, directing, sustaining our attention, specifically inward. So again, many Buddhist traditions would certainly say what's happening is a question by looking inward, what's happening. Then there's a how, then there's a why, I think. And you might actually even try to go in that order. Oh, so I'm feeling a tension in my chest. Actually, I was just doing this morning. I was downstairs. I was up here working a little bit in my office, and then went downstairs to have breakfast. And I realized I was carrying a lot of tension.
Mm.
I'm like, wow, where's that coming from? What's that about? And then so I noticed the what, and I guess the how even. I noticed I was kind of uncomfortable. Then where is it? And then I was like, okay, let's unpack what just happened. Why is that? And then I also had maybe this is a piece too. The motivation came, and I said, yeah, I'm going to be exhausted if I'm carrying around this tension all day, and I
Mm.
don't want that. That's not going to feel good. If I'm not going to be able to do what I want to do if I'm worn out because I'm so tense for 3 hours. I need to be able to sustain that. So I think that kind of I don't know if that's illuminating as a kind of concrete example. But I guess one last thought comes to mind. There's a whole stream in Buddhist thinking of direct knowledge. Like I can tell you, kind of describe what I experience, and I can give you some suggestions and pointers on what you might do on some of these things. But the nature, what we're talking about, self-awareness, is you having direct knowledge of you. So I can't get in there. That's totally subjective. I can point you, but I can't do it. That is the nature of this relationship, you to yourself, self-awareness. And that has to be made, and that path has to be constructed by the individual. So I can point, and there's this metaphor in Buddhism, like I can point to the moon, but my pointing is not you doing it. And the moon actually is your moon, not my moon,
Right.
so to speak.
Right.
And there's a fundamental difference in the exchange between me and you, and the relationship between you and you to get to where you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is a mystery to some extent. It is outside of our ability to explain to somebody, right?
Right.
Makes sense. Someone you want to know, your fellow parishioner asking you, how do you do that? What is that? And also the limitations on our ability to explain that.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. All right. Well, good discussion. Trying to keep to our instead of going off for 2 hours like we usually do. So good stuff. All right.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, it's a good way to start off the day, and we'll be back soon.